Sebastian KORB is currently a lecturer at the University of Essex, as well as being the head of the recently founded KORB Lab. He had a very European education. That is, he obtained his bachelor in Strasbourg, his master in cognitive neuroscience in the Utrecht University in Netherlands, and he did a PhD in experimental psychology in Geneva. Let me be, as a personal note, I'm particularly happy to have him giving the kickoff to this webinar series. And well, let's say it's karma, Sebastian. So thank you for being here.
Well, thanks a lot for the invitation and for this very nice and kind introduction. Of course, it's obvious to everybody, especially after this introduction, that I study faces, and you're probably familiar with the fact that faces convey lots of information. Like very quickly, when you meet somebody, you might recognize their identity based on their face if you know this person. But we can also very quickly infer somebody's emotions based on their facial expressions. You also might detect their approximate age, whether they're male or female, where they are what they're paying attention to. So, for example, where their gaze is, the direction of their gaze is, and combining intention, emotion, and focus of attention, you might infer their intentions, for example. We also detect somebody's ethnicity, attractiveness, trustworthiness, health, etc. And these different aspects of faces are typically, by classical models of at least of face processing, they're clustered into two distinct categories. So we have the so-called invariant aspects or features of faces that do not change or change slowly. And we have the variant aspects of faces that change very rapidly. I, in my research, normally focus on variant aspects and specifically on emotions, or facial expressions of emotion. And the type of questions that I normally study are like, how do we perceive and produce facial expressions of emotion? And when these two things come together, so when we mimic somebody else's expression, what can we do with that? What is the role of this facial mimicry, for example, in emotion recognition? And however, more recently, I've embarked in a little bit of research where I bring in also invariant aspects of faces. And if time allows, I hope to be able to tell you today, for example, about research on how emotion and sex of the face interacts and how we perceive emotions differently in male and female faces. So I'm not only have I studied and worked a little bit around different countries, but I also have used different techniques. I am, in fact, half a psychologist and half a neuroscientist, and typically I try to both measure things and interfere with aspects of emotion perception or production. So besides behavior and self-report, I measure activity in facial muscles using electromyography, or I try to measure activity in the brain using EEG or fMRI, sometimes in combination. As I said, another aspect, another way of studying a phenomenon is to interfere with it. And so, for example, we can use transcranial magnetic stimulation to temporarily inhibit aspects, parts of the brain, and see, therefore, what role they play in a certain process. I've also used pharmacology to change levels of the hormone oxytocin in the brain, or the neurotransmitters dopamine and the opiate system. And recently, when COVID allows, I'm actually trying to develop a technique to stimulate facial muscles with electricity. We call this neuromuscular electrical stimulation. So I was told that the topic of today, and maybe of the entire series, is faces across context. So of course I scratched my head and I thought, like, okay, which parts of my research fit to this topic? And I'm going to try to present to you 3 context. Now, hopefully, my interpretation of what a context is corresponds is okay for you. So first, I'm going to talk about something which is closer to home for me. So I'm going to talk about how face proprioception creates a context for the visual perception of faces. And then I'm going to talk about something that I just heard you might be interested in. So how emotional expressions are perceived differently, depending on whether participants see or do not see a hijab, which is the Islamic headdress. And finally, I would like to talk about this interaction between emotion and sex in faces. Okay, so let's get started with the first so-called context, facial proprioception. And this is work which I've carried out over many years with many people. They wouldn't fit all into this slide, and so I would just mention Didier Grandjean, my PhD supervisor, and Paula Niedenthal, postdoc supervisor. I didn't know exactly how much of this you know, how much you don't, so I'm going to go into a quick and short overview about proprioceptive feedback, which consists in information from facial muscles going to the brain. And essentially, the brain is informed about the state of muscle contractions in the face. Now, this is fundamental in order for us to be able to finally control facial muscles, for example, when you're speaking. Unfortunately, the underlying mechanism allowing for this proprioceptive feedback from the face is not entirely understood. And the reason is that even though we know quite a lot about proprioception, also called kinesthesia, in skeletal muscles outside of the face, where, for example, you have muscle spindles that get stretched when the muscle gets stretched, and can therefore induce muscle contraction, which allows you to prevent injuries and not to drop your origins in this case. But the face is a bit of an anomaly, and so in facial muscles there are no muscle spindles. So for a long time people were like either saying, well, there is no facial feedback, or they were saying facial feedback needs to come from somewhere else. And one hypothesis was that it comes from receptors in the skin, because when you move facial muscles, you might stretch the skin, which overlays the muscles, and therefore feedback to the brain comes from stretching of the skin. Now, this is probably the case, but in addition to that, recent studies by a Spanish group where they have essentially dissected cadavers, they have found that they are in fact atypical proprioceptors. They call them like this, atypical proprioceptors in facial muscles, specifically, for example, in the zygomaticus muscle. In addition to that, they've shown that there are many connections between the facial nerve, which is the main motor nerve innervating the facial muscles, and the trigeminal nerve, which is the main sensory nerve. And this might also contribute to the neural basis of proprioceptive facial feedback. So, of course, now that we have established or explained how feedback from the face comes to the brain, well, we can go to the next step, which is the facial feedback hypothesis, which has been put forward, saying that when we activate facial muscles, we do eventually, this feedback has an effect on our own mood and or on how we perceive faces, on facial expressions and others. And maybe the most famous article that was suggesting exactly that was one published by Fritz Strack and colleagues in 1988. So it's a very simple design. They have two groups of participants, and one group is asked to hold a pen between the lips without touching it with the teeth, and this makes smiling almost impossible. And the other half of participants activates the smiling muscle because they are asked to hold the pen between the teeth without closing their lips. Both groups of participants get to see cartoons, which are mildly funny, and it turns out that the cartoons are rated as being funnier by the group who was holding the pen between the teeth. The interpretation was, well, when you cannot activate the smiling muscles, then you find cartoons less funny, and therefore sort of proof of the facial feedback hypothesis. However, it's important to say that this exact study has not been replicated across 17 different laboratories, where in each lab you had at least 100 participants. And I participated when I was in CISA. We participated in this. We were not able to replicate this study, and from there on, there has been a lot of debate on the facial feedback hypothesis. But as it is in science, things are often not black or white. And in fact, in 2018 came out this study, which I think is very interesting, which also was a replication of the original study by Fritz Strack and colleagues. But they had two conditions now: one with a webcam, clearly visible to participants, and one without. Excuse me. So the important thing is that they found the original effect only when the camera was absent, was not present. While when the camera was visible, the effect was gone. Well, why is it important? Because in the replication study, they had a camera. And so it might be that the camera makes people aware of being looked at and has an effect on this visual feedback. A meta-analysis by the Jeff Larson group that was published just 2 years ago came to the conclusion that the available evidence supports the visual feedback hypothesis' central claim that visual feedback influences emotional experience, although these effects tend to be small and heterogeneous. So it depends on what stimuli you use and what task you have. Okay, and there's actually more evidence, which I don't have time to go into now, but let's say that I don't think we need to give up the visual feedback hypothesis just now. And one case where facial feedback hypothesis comes into play is facial mimicry. So before I showed you an example of people looking at cartoons, and now I'm going to switch to talk about people looking at faces. Because facial mimicry is that when you see somebody else's facial expression, you tend to imitate that expression, and then you get feedback from your own face, and therefore I would like to say that this gives you some sort of context, proprioceptive context to the visual face. Importantly, this facial mimicry consists of activations which are small in amplitude, and therefore we typically in a lab we use these electrodes which we put on top of the skin to record facial muscles, for example the corrugator, which is the main frowning muscle, or the zygomaticus, which is the main smiling muscle. And a typical finding, which was first found, I think, by Dimberg and has been replicated so many times that I cannot count them, is that the corrugator activates more to angry than to happy faces, for example, while the zygomaticus shows the opposite pattern. Facial mimicry occurs relatively rapidly, and you can measure differences between conditions after 200 or 300 milliseconds already. And it has been said to be found in newborns already after 36 hours after birth. Although you need to know that there's quite a debate about whether this finding also replicates or not. And if you're interested, here are some references in the bottom right. Facial mimicry has been reported in non-human primate species. And this is quite interesting to me, facial mimicry can occur when you're not even consciously aware of an emotional phase being presented. So for example, healthy participants, when they see, in quotes, a face, a smiling face, for example, for just 30 milliseconds, which is then immediately masked, so succeeded by a neutral face, while they nevertheless show the same facial mimicry pattern as if the emotional face had been shown for much longer. I'm now virtually speaking in Turin, I think, in Torino, and Marco Tamietto, I believe, is also in Torino right now, but in 2009, when he published a very interesting paper, he might have been in the Netherlands, I believe. Anyway, this paper by Tamietto and De Gelder and colleagues was showing that patients who have lesions in the visual cortex, like you can see here, this patient has a big, in quotes, hole at the back of the head where the right visual cortex lies. And the symptoms of these patients are that they cannot see what is presented to the contralateral, so on the other side, so the contralateral visual hemifield. Whatever you show to this person on the left side of their nose, they will not see. They will say there's nothing. And whatever you show on the right side of the nose, they will see. Why? Because the connection of the facial nerve go contralateral to the other hemisphere. The interesting thing is that Tamieto and colleagues showed that when you show emotional faces and bodies, it doesn't matter to what side you show them, they will lead to the same emotional facial reactions in the observer, suggesting that you don't even need to be aware of the stimulus, and you don't need a visual cortex to show facial mimicry. It might come from subcortical areas like the amygdala. Facial mimicry is also hard to inhibit. In this study, we had participants actually do voluntary smiling, and we recorded activity from the facial muscles, and they were doing this voluntary smiling in two conditions. So there was a congruent condition where very frequently they would see a happy face, and they were asked to smile in return with a closed mouth. And sometimes they would see a neutral face, and in 25% of the trials, and then they were asked just to not do anything and keep a neutral face themselves. However, in an incongruent condition, very frequently you would see a neutral face, and you would have to smile to the neutral face, while sometimes you would see a happy face, and to the happy face you would stay neutral. So you can, of course, see what we were trying to do, and we found that in Go trials, when you compare across conditions, people were both faster and could activate their smiling muscles more strongly when they were seeing a happy compared to a neutral face. While in no-go trials, people made more false alarms, so they smiled even though they were supposed to stay neutral when a happy face was shown. And even when we excluded those false alarms, we nevertheless found greater activation of the smiling muscle, the zygomaticus, in response to happy than to neutral faces. So happy faces would be the red line here. So we took this as evidence suggesting that very quickly, when you see a smiling face on the screen, this induces the tendency to imitate it, which, depending on what you're supposed to do, will either help you to smile quickly or will make it hard for you to suppress and to inhibit smiling. In other work that I'm not going to present now, we have found that this facial mimicry, actually matters because it predicts how authentic you will find a smile. And we were trying to look at the involvement of the right somatosensory and motor cortices, and we inhibited them with TMS and found evidence that indeed both might be relevant for facial mimicry. As I said before, we administered oxytocin to males and found that facial mimicry was increased, especially for infant faces in, well, we said anger, but it's actually more distress. And I also collaborated with the group of Vismadev Chakrabarty in Reading, and there we found that facial mimicry was modulated by joint attention, so whether you make eye contact, but this also depended on the autistic traits of the perceiver. And finally, 2 years ago, I published a joint EMG fMRI study where we looked at the role of the medial prefrontal cortex, which is this area marked in red here, the front of your head, which might be top-down inhibiting facial mimicry when you see somebody that you have previously learned to associate, for example, with losing money, so somebody you essentially do not like. What is the role of facial mimicry? Well, I'm going to say what the role is based on theories of embodied cognition that maybe you're familiar with. According to these theories, facial mimicry is generally conceived of as an automatic motor copy. So it's, maybe you've heard of the perception behavior link. And this has been criticized, but newer models, like the CODES model by Winkelmann, Coulson, and Edenthal, actually allow for quite some dynamic and context-sensitive features to facial mimicry. Facial mimicry might contribute to emotional cognition, which does not mean that you do need facial mimicry to recognize a face. And why might it contribute to emotional cognition? Well, because when we perceive and think about emotions, we tend to recreate and re-experience certain things, like at the perceptual level, at the somatovisceral level, and at the motoric level. And all of this is called embodiment. And this is believed to have causal effects on how we process and information, especially emotional information. There's quite some studies indeed that suggest that when you block facial mimicry or interfere with facial feedback, and this can be done in many ways, including with Botox and holding pens, etc. Well, then you find that people are less good or slower at detecting facial expressions or distinguishing between different types of facial expressions. There's also a study that has shown that people who had Botox injections to their corrugator muscle, which is a frowning muscle, when you show them angry faces, which typically activate the amygdala, an emotion center in your brain, well, patients with paralyzed frowning muscles have a reduced activation of the amygdala to angry faces. Yeah, and so far I've told you a lot about measuring activity in the face, but I've embarked together with colleagues from Vienna and the Netherlands and people in my lab. We've embarked on quite an adventure, which is trying to do the opposite. So instead of recording activity in the face, we want to trigger activity in the face with electricity. And this is both something which is quite old and very new. Quite old because at the middle of the 19th century, Duchenne de Boulogne, a French neurologist, he used electricity in, I think in this case, this is a patient who was quite tolerating pain, or maybe had even no pain in the face. Why am I saying this? Because Duchenne de Boulogne was using very strong electrical currents, and this can be painful or at least discomforting. These were the early days of photography, and these famous photographies were taken showing how different facial muscles activate. And I think Darwin even made some copies, some drawings of these. So this was the old part, but in modern research, neuromuscular electrical stimulation has not been used much in the face at all. In fact, it has been used a lot. Maybe you know it more under the name of TENS for activating or muscles, skeletal muscles outside of the face. For example, if you want to train your muscles without going to the gym. There are also now websites that sell some sort of electrical stimulation to for the face to look better, apparently. And I don't know if there is any evidence for that, but that's quite interesting. I really became fascinated by this when I met Arthur Elsener, this Dutch artist who has, I think, 25 years of experience with using neuromuscular electrical stimulation for performances. And I'm just going to play this video a little bit to show you what it is about. Okay. Yeah, this was just a short moment to show how you can activate quite precisely facial muscles using this technique. And the music doesn't matter, of course, it's for Arthur's performance. Now, what Arthur is doing is not really transposable one-to-one to the lab. And that's why we have been working to try to find the best stimulation parameters, electrodes, positions, etc., to reliably activate, you can see the zygomaticus muscle and the depressor anguli oris. And one of the issues we're also working on is that we were trying to record activity of the brain at the same time using EEG, and that's not easy because you get a lot of artifacts. You know, you're recording electricity with EEG while you're injecting electricity in the face, and obviously that's creating artifacts. So I don't have much data, unfortunately, to show you about this right now because the labs at the University of Essex were shut for 15 months. So we couldn't really acquire a lot of data. We got a little pilot underway, and people had to categorize emotions. There were emotions going from angry to happy over 5 levels. And here on the y-axis, you can see the probability that participant says, this is a happy face. Now we had 2 conditions, without any stimulation and with stimulation of the smiling muscle. And unfortunately, so far we found 0 behavioral effect. So we're now tinkering with the paradigm, with the stimulation to see if we can find an effect. And of course, we're looking also at the EEG. So maybe next time I can give you an update. Okay, just to summarize this first section, when we observe facial expressions, we tend to imitate them, which is called facial mimicry. This mimicry starts very early after birth. Maybe we're already born with it. It occurs also in non-human primates. It occurs rapidly, is difficult to inhibit, and does not require awareness of the stimulus. But at the same time, facial mimicry is modulated by the context and can be inhibited. I think that since we're talking about faces in context, one can think of facial mimicry and the facial feedback it creates as a proprioceptive context. And importantly, this is a context that matters because it can contribute to emotion recognition. And as such, yeah, this I have just said, sorry. I'm going to move to context number 2, unless I don't think there are any questions. Okay.
You can write out chat in questions in the chat if you wish. If that's a good moment, people. Otherwise, let's enjoy the second part.
Yeah, the second part is about the hijab, and this is work which I've done with Tuba Deniz and Benji Ünal from TED University in Ankara. Alistair Clark, who is a colleague at the University of Essex and has a background in mathematics, and Giorgia Silani at the University of Vienna, my former postdoc supervisor. So,
okay,
yeah.
So there is one quick and very interesting question.
Sure.
I'd like to read aloud, coming from Remo. He asks, to what extent facial mimicry can be faked? You can reply now, a bit now, and a bit later, as you prefer.
Yeah, absolutely. Facial mimicry can be faked. Now, this is not something that I study normally because, in fact, I exclude trials which have large activity of the facial muscles. And I would expect that if you fake something, that it's going to be, you know, at a stronger, larger amplitude. But yes, you can fake facial expressions, right? Like you can do a fake smile, so you can also fake facial mimicry. And we do this. We do mimic not. I think to a certain extent we all do this in order to signal to the other person that we have friendly intentions to them, whether we are aware of it or not. But you know, not all of mimicry is this hard motor copy. Absolutely, I agree with that, and that's one of the difficulties. How do you distinguish between different types of mimicry? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so in this study, we were interested about the effects of Islamic headdresses on emotion perception. And why? Well, because in Western societies, it's common to have prejudice about these Islamic headdresses. And I, by the way, I'm not a specialist at all about this, but there's literature that tells me that this is the case, and that this prejudice actually is an obstacle to the integration of Muslims in Western societies. Previous research has looked a little bit at this question, and for example, Mariska de Kret in the Netherlands has, in a first study with Beatrice de Gelder, has looked at how faces with the headdress, especially with the niqab, which is the much less revealing or more conservative headdress, which is almost like a burqa. So when Western participants looked at faces with the niqab, with different facial expressions, they actually said that they perceived more fear and less happiness in these faces compared to faces without the niqab. And in a, we could say in the follow-up study, again by Mariska de Kret and this time Agneta Fischer, they looked at emotion perception again in Westerners when they were looking at faces with the Islamic headdress compared to faces that had a Western headdress. They call it cap and shawl, as you can see here. Yeah, and they found that in the faces with the Islamic headdress, Western participants perceived less happiness and more sadness. Now, we sort of follow up on that, and we're like, oh, and of course, sorry, this of course is sort of in agreement with a general cultural in-group advantage for facial emotional cognition. So we're typically better at perceive emotions in our cultural in-group. We wanted to follow this up, asking whether this emotion recognition accuracy, especially when it is measured somewhat more implicitly, and I'm going to explain you in a moment what I mean by that. Well, does emotional recognition accuracy relate to something that you report explicitly? So like your self-reported thoughts or about or attitude towards the hijab. Yeah, essentially, do you like or do you dislike the fact that women wear the hijab? And moreover, we wanted to compare how these two things relate to each other, not only in a Western country as it had been done so far, but also in a country which is predominantly Islamic, and we chose Turkey. So this is what we did. We had 141 participants in two groups. One group was in Austria, Vienna, and the other one in Turkey, in Ankara. And the two groups were absolutely similar in age, gender distribution, level of education, and type of studies. In fact, they were, for the most part, young psychology students in a capital. And this might be important to us understand the results. In terms of stimuli, we had 8 different faces. They were all female. We took them from one of those validated databases, which is called NIMSTIM. And they were in 2 emotions, happy and sad. And we morphed between neutral faces and happy and neutral faces and sad to create 5 levels of intensity, as you can see in the image at the top right. In addition, we added to each face either an oval mask or the hijab. It's always the same hijab around each face. And to measure participants' attitude towards the hijab, we had this little questionnaire. So how much acceptance, admiration, and affection do you have towards women wearing the hijab? Or how much you disapprove of this, etc. So here's the task that we used, and this is a task that gets a little bit at the implicit reactions that you have to these faces. So it's called the mouse tracker task. It is similar to the implicit association test, but in addition to accuracy and reaction time, you can also measure in real time the motor aspects of participants' response. So it works like this. Participants first go and click with their mouse onto the button start, which is at the bottom of the screen in the center. And then a face appears, in this case, a sad face. And then they need to choose the label. Of course, in this case, it would be the sad label. In order to do so, they have to move the mouse until they reach the right corner. The sides where sad and happy are written are, of course, counterbalanced across participants. And they need to do that quickly, otherwise they're reminded to go faster. So they're pushed to go fast. And in this example here of a trial, you see that instead of going straight in a straight line from the start button to the label, which would be the fastest way, the participant has sort of gone straight up and even a little bit towards the left, towards the label of happiness. And then in the end, they went right, and the response was correct. Yeah, they did click on sadness, which is correct, but we can measure this area under the curve, and the larger the area under the curve, the more we can infer that the concept of happiness was activated in that trial. Yeah. So here are the results. First, we had hypothesized that maybe in Austria, participants would be a little bit less positive about the hijab in their self-reported answer to the questionnaire. This was not the case. You can see that the distribution of the attitude towards the hijab was basically identical in both countries. In fact, the median was identical. But nevertheless, you get a nice spread here. And we use this as a continuous variable to see how it influenced, or not, how it influenced participants in their mouse tracker task responses. Here are a series of results across the 3 different dependent variables where we compare Austrians and Turkish participants. First of all, in terms of accuracy, participants tended to make more mistakes in categorizing happy faces. The more so, the more negative the attitude towards the hijab was. So if they had said in the questionnaire, yeah, I don't feel very positive about women wearing the hijab, then they tended to categorize happy faces as sad. And you can see that this was present more in the Austrian than in the Turkish sample. Indeed, when we split by country, we find it significant only in the Austrian sample. The area under the curve, which, as I explained, measures a little bit how much you are activated, how much you have activated in your mind the other concept of the other emotion. Well, this area under the curve was also larger the more negative your attitude towards the hijab for happy faces. And these 5 different lines here are for the 5 intensity levels of the facial expression. So the weaker the intensity of the expression, so that would be 20%, and the larger the area under the curve, and again, this becomes larger the more negative your attitude towards the hijab. For sad faces, it is kind of the opposite. The more positive you feel about the hijab, and the more you tend to go towards the level of happiness when you're actually categorizing sad faces. I forgot to say something important. This area under the curve is measured only for correct trials, so trials where they chose the correct label in the end. And the same applies to reaction time, also only for correct trials. Here we find, and across all 3 dependent variables, it's essentially only significant in the Austrian sample. We find that the more negative the attitude towards the hijab, the slower you are to correctly categorize happy faces. Yeah. Now, there's another set of results where this time we look only at Turkish participants and we compare faces with and without the hijab. Why did we do this only in Turkish participants? Because the way we have run the task or the experiment, we first acquired the data in Austria, and there we only had faces with the hijab, and then we acquired data in Turkey, and there we added the control condition. So unfortunately, this comparison I cannot do in the Austrian participants. Now, remember that the Turkish participants, the explicit attitude towards the hijab in this sample did not predict their emotion categorization bias in the mouse tracker task. Nevertheless, Turkish participants seem to show a bias for happy faces with the hijab. So, for example, the number of errors in happy faces with the hijab is larger than in happy faces with the mask. Or the area under the curve in happy faces with the hijab, especially at low intensities of the emotion, is larger than for faces with the mask. And the same applies for reaction time, where you have lower responses for correct trials in faces with their job that are happy and of low intensity. So to summarize this, there seems to be a bias to perceive mildly happy faces with their job as being sad. And this was found in both countries, in Austria and in Turkey. In the two countries, we found the exact same distribution of their explicitly reported attitude towards the hijab, but only in Austria, this explicit attitude predicted emotion recognition bias in the mouse tracker task. Now, I thought that maybe we can speculate that in both countries, participants actually had similar religious and political views, even though we expected them to differ, because one country is predominantly Christian, while the other one is predominantly Muslim. Well, it turns out that in these particular samples, maybe they had similar religious and political views, because they were all young university students living in a capital. But how do you explain then that their explicit views predicted their responses, their implicit responses in categorizing the faces only in the Austrian sample and not in the Turkish sample? Well, maybe because in Turkey, they were somewhat less sincere in reporting their attitude towards the hijab, because Turkey is known to be the so-called tight culture, where you have more and stronger norms, and it is less tolerated to deviate from these norms. Okay, so I would like at some point maybe to follow this up by, of course, trying to record not just the attitude towards the hijab of participants, but get more at their general religious and political views, and maybe also try to collect data from participants, especially in Turkey, that are in a less international and academic environment. Okay, so are there any questions, Marco, or?
I see none, but that might be
okay.
We are in time, so we can ask for questions if someone has any. I have a tiny one actually. Did you control for right-handedness since it was a mouse task?
Good question. I did not. No, I don't think so. And I think they were instructed. So this was done in the lab, and they were instructed to use the dominant hand for responding. So if they were left-handers, they would use the mouse, and it was not done on a trackpad, but with a real mouse, you know.
If so, I don't think there's anything to worry about.
I don't know, probably not. Okay, so do I have a little bit more time, maybe 10 minutes to talk about this?
Yeah, I'd say so. Go ahead, please.
Great, okay. So I'm going to go to what I call the third context. This is work which I've done with Marc Mehu from Webster University and a student of his, and then colleagues at the University of Vienna, Claudia Massacesi, Nace Mikus. And well, for a part which I actually am not going to present today about voices, also with Sonja Kotz and a student of hers from Maastricht University. So essentially, I've talked before about variant and invariant aspects of faces. For example, emotion being variant and sex being invariant. And you can see here from this orthogonality that typically these two things are not believed to interact, both not in the cognitive way and also not in a neural way, at least not very early in the face processing stream. But actually, there's quite a lot of research which suggests that they do interact, and that typically happiness is associated more with female faces and anger more with male faces. For example, when you ask people to imagine an angry face, they think of a man. When you ask them to imagine a happy face, they think of a woman, on average. If you then show them happy and angry faces by males and females, they are faster and more accurate to categorize anger in males and happiness in females. And it goes the other way around also. So they're faster to categorize maleness in angry faces and femaleness in happy faces. This importantly has been found both with real faces and with avatar faces. And this is just one example of a study which was published a few years ago, where they had 126 participants, and they had to do a categorization task, so they had to say for each face whether it was happy or angry. And this is the example of one participant. So on the x-axis, you see the emotion going from anger to happiness, and on the y-axis, you see the percentage of time the participants actually said, yeah, this is a happy face. So of course, the percentage goes up in the responses as it does in the stimulus. And what participants were interested in was to calculate the PSE, the point of subjective equality, where a participant has a 50-50 chance to say that that face is either happy or angry. Now you see here male and female faces, two different graphs, and the PSE shifts. So the idea is that in male faces, you need more happiness. So the PSE is closer towards the happiness pole. You need more happiness before people say, well, there's 50-50 chance that this is happy. And in female faces, you need less happiness. It goes even a little bit into the angry direction. This is what they found on average. You can see here the PSE for male faces was further towards happiness than for female faces. We actually replicated this using the exact same stimuli and same paradigm. So it seems to be quite a robust effect. And now, okay, but one question which has not been asked very often is which of these two effects is stronger? So I told you before that when we categorize emotions or react to emotions, we're influenced by the sex of the face. But some studies also looked at when you're categorizing the sex of the face, and they show that you're influenced by the emotion. Which of these effects is bigger had not been asked, or at least very little so. And when it has been asked by a set of studies that use the Garner paradigm, which I'm going to explain in a second, they came to the conclusion that sex was actually had the bigger effect when it was the task irrelevant or implicit dimension. So it would be like this. The Garner task, it's a categorization task where you have to very quickly say if a face, they have done it with different stimuli, but now we focus on faces. You have to say very quickly if a face is happy or angry. And you typically have two conditions, and you focus on reaction time. So you have a baseline condition where, for example, faces differ in their emotion, but are all of the same sex. So you would have female faces that are happy and angry. Or they differ in their sex, but have the same emotion. And then you have an orthogonal condition where they differ in all four. So these are different blocks, baseline blocks and orthogonal blocks. And then you look at the average reaction time, and so far it was found by most Garner studies that reaction time does not differ between the baseline and the orthogonal condition when you are categorizing the sex. However, when you're categorizing the emotion, then you're much slower in the orthogonal condition. And the interpretation is that you're not able to pay selective attention to the emotion because sex is much more important. When you see the sex of her face, that's going to overrule the processing of the sex is going to overrule the processing of the emotion. Not overrule, but it's going to take some time. Now I'm going to try to show you that across several experiments, well, it might be the other way around, that it's actually emotion which has a bigger effect on sex than the other way. So what we did is we created a set of stimuli, 121 faces using avatars, and we created facial expression using the FACS, the facial action coding system, which is a bit the most common way to code facial expressions. And this is like how they look. So these are just some examples of these faces. They look a bit spooky because they don't have hair, they don't have ears, but they're very well lined and controlled. And we used these faces first in an online rating experiment with 76 participants who had to either say how happy versus angry the face was or how much male versus female the face was. And here are the results. So on the left, we see that on the x-axis, that is the emotion of the face going from angry to happy. On the y-axis, you see the rating that participants gave from angry to happy. So of course, the more happiness there's in the stimulus, and the more the rating of happiness goes up. But as expected, we also find that female faces, shown in pinkish here, consistently get higher ratings of happiness than male faces in blue. And what happens when participants rate the sex of the face? Again, we find, as expected, that ratings of maleness are higher for angry faces in red compared to happy faces in yellow. This is also visible in heat maps, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. Here's where we compare the strengths of these effects. So in terms of strength of the effects, I mean the steepness of the slope. Yeah. So when you are comparing the effects that you're actually focusing on, so I call them explicit or task relevant, if you prefer, well, then there's actually no difference in the strength of these effects, emotion and sex. But looking at the dimension which is task irrelevant or implicit, you find that the emotion has a bigger effect because the slope is steeper. And if I just go back to this graph, you see that the distance between the red and the yellow line is larger than the distance between the pink and the blue line. And that shows you that the effect of emotion on sex is more important. Okay, but this was rating. Yeah?
Seba, we have a question. I think it's a quick one, so let me unmute Andrea Bonarini. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Up.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't hear anymore.
Okay, now it's fine?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the question is, there are many different faces with the same sex. So how much of the effect of the specific face that you have selected to express emotions can affect this sex effect?
You mean the specific face identity?
Yes, I mean, so your face is different from mine, is different from Marco's, and so and so. And there are traits that may affect some emotions more than others. For instance, a round face may be perceived more happy than a long face, or something like this, as well known in cartoons and these kind of things. So you have selected a specific face to represent men and a specific face to represent a woman, and how much this specific face may affect the perception of emotion, for instance.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a little bit that's also what we were after. So male faces tend to have a more squared jaw and a more prominent eyebrow.
Yeah.
And for example, when you're expressing anger, your eyebrows come down. I realize now that my light is almost off, so
yeah, but it is evident also from the images you show. So, for instance, the anger in the man is much more evident. The eyebrow are much more evident than a woman.
Yes.
But they may be less evident in other men.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, we're speaking here of average effects, and not every man has prominent eyebrows, and not every woman has a round jaw. I totally agree. So the way we created these avatars was there are settings that you can set in the software FaceTime, and you well, maybe it's too small for you to see, but you can go onto very male or very female, and keep everything else constant, and that's essentially what we did. And we also did this research with voices. I was not going to talk about this today, but there we took real people speaking vowels as angry or happy, and we essentially replicate the same effects. So I don't know if I gave the right answer to your question, but I would say that of course we took avatar faces, which are not real faces. And one thing which would need to be done is to replicate these real faces. I would expect though that it works just the same way. And the avatars that we created had features, facial features, which were characteristic of males and characteristic of females. Now, does this work with every face? Probably it doesn't. So it's what we're studying. We're studying an average phenomenon.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you.
Okay, so
Andre, so go ahead, but please close in 5 minutes if you could.
yes, okay. I'm going to go a little faster. So we did the same phases, but now categorization in the lab. 108 participants. At each phase, they have to say happy or angry, or male or female, and essentially we replicate the results. So we find that people tend to say more often that it's a happy phase when it's a female phase. And we have here 11 lines, by the way, which are all the mores in between from female to male. And when they categorize the sex, they tend to see more often, they tend to push more often the button for male categorization when it's an angry phase. Again, you can see that the distance between the red and the yellow line is larger than between the pink and the blue line, suggesting that the effect, the implicit effect of emotion, this red line here on the right, is steeper, as you can see here, has a larger effect than the implicit effect of sex. Now, okay, so we already discussed a little bit, does this happen with all phases? But another question is, why do other people using the Garner task come to the opposite conclusion that sex has a big effect? And just as a reminder, it would look like this. So sex classification would have the same reaction time for control and orthogonal conditions, while emotion classification would become slower for the orthogonal condition. So, well, that's what we did. We had, with these phases, participants categorize them in a Garner task. And I'm not going to go now into the details, but essentially we use a subset of phases, and you need to split them into baseline conditions and orthogonal conditions. And we found that in the orthogonal condition, again, participants are influenced by the other dimension, but especially when they're categorizing sex, they're influenced by the emotion. You see the distance between the lines is larger on the right than on the left. And on the right here, I'm showing you the average reaction time, which is slower in the orthogonal condition for both categorizing the emotion and the sex. So actually, also using the Garner task, we replicate what we found before. And I could talk about why this is the case, but going towards the end, just to add one more study, we were trying to see whether we can mess with this effect by priming participants, priming them with pro-social and anti-social actions associated with male or female names. So we used a task which was published by the Muscle-Brusk group, or used by the Muscle-Brusk group, and we had 132 participants that were doing again the same categorization task of angry, happy. But before each block of 36 trials, they would do this sentence completion task. And these sentences were describing pro-social or anti-social actions, like, and you had to complete it. So then, you would learn it. We actually did not find any effect of the priming, but again, we replicated the results we had before, that male is associated with angry and female with happy. So to summarize that, so this is, I think, in our data, there's definitely a strong suggestion, and this is partly a replication of what had already been shown in literature, that happiness is judged to be more intense in female phases and anger in male phases. And we have found this with real phases using the same stimuli as a study published some years ago, and with avatar phases. There were actually several, I don't remember by heart now, but in the study with the real phases, I think there were 6 or 8 different identities, so that maybe partially answers also the question we had before. We then created these highly controlled avatar phases, and again, in 4 different studies with overall 372 participants, found this association. I don't have time to talk about it today, but we also did it with voices, changing in emotion and in sex, and found the same effect, or very similar effect. So I think I have to wrap up, so that if you have questions, we have time for them. Overall, I today I try to present to you some of my work in light of this idea of faces in context. And I've talked about the fact that we recognize emotional facial expressions very rapidly and for the most time effortlessly. But of course, there are a series of contextual factors that can impact emotional cognition. So for example, proprioceptive feedback, when you are mimicking somebody and your brain gets feedback from your own facial muscles, which I suggested contributes to emotional cognition. Then we have looked into how the hijab, a religious or cultural marker, creates a bias so that you tend to perceive more sadness in faces which are actually mildly happy. And this happens, interestingly, both in Austrian and Turkish participants. And we have looked at this link between the sex of the face, so whether it has more masculine or more feminine features, for example, the eyebrow and the square jaw. And there we find this association between male angry and female happy. So I have to thank you for your attention, and my collaborators, especially my supervisors Didier Grandjean, Paula Niedenthal, Giorgia Silani, and my friend and collaborator Marc Mehu in Vienna. Thank you very much.